Lionel, is that you?
There, I think I got it. Dave?
Lionel.
Dave?
Good evening, Lionel.
Good evening, Dave. Dave, I'm kind of excited tonight.
I'm excited too. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's going to be an hour and 45 minutes of just you and I talking about the good old times.
Okay. That's not the rumor I heard. In fact, I passed somebody in the green room as we walked in.
We got a lot. Remember there several months ago, and let's see, when was it? Don't tell me. Let me guess. It was like the middle of June. It was the middle of June, and we did viewer mail number 82, where it was just you and I talking.
I remember. Yeah.
Yeah. People are like, okay, you guys can stop doing that now.
Well, at least they're being honest with you. That's exactly. A good thing.
Tonight's guest. Do you remember who Merv Griffin is?
Wow, that's a name I haven't heard for some time. My dad used to love Merv Griffin. Yes.
And Johnny Carson and all those guys.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
They used to always say, I've always wanted to say this, our next guest needs no introduction. I've always wanted to say that. You know, when like Bob Hope would come out or Clint Eastwood or some big star would come out, they'd go, blah, blah, blah. They're going to be doing this, this, and this. But our next guest needs no introduction. And then they'd introduce him anyways. Do you remember that?
Of course. Absolutely. And I think in the world of model railroading, I think our guest tonight needs no introduction.
Absolutely no introduction. What should our first question be?
Well, hey, I let experts be experts in my world, buddy. And you're the expert, so you get to choose.
No, give me a hint. What would you like the first question to be that we ever ask him on the? Because I'm sure he's listened to all the AML podcasts and some of them twice.
Right, like I did the first time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There's a lot of people I've looked up to for a lot of years in this hobby, and I think what I would love to hear is what the best thing was in the hobby when this guy got started and when he really started to hit his stride with it, compared to what he thinks the best thing in the hobby is now.
Well, that's a good question.
Maybe it's the same thing. Maybe it's something different. But I'm excited to sit back tonight and listen to you two guys talk. This is going to be great. This is going to be great.
That's why you're here. You're the talker. I'm just.
Well, yeah.
I'll steer the ship. I got the first question. Okay, I got it in my head. Can you ask our guests to come on in out of the?
All right. Let me walk down there. All right, Tony, here we go.
Tony, come on into the studio.
Good to see you, sir.
Well, good evening, guys.
Good evening.
Do you know who that is, Dave?
I know just who that is, yes.
It's none other than the soul, it's like the James Brown of model railroading.
I guess there's a lot of analogies.
There are.
This. But this is a guy who's touched a lot of the different parts of this hobby. And Tony, it's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. This is fun.
Tony Custer is here to talk to us all about model railroading and other things. I have lots of other things. So Tony, while you were in the green room, Dave and I were discussing about the first question we wanted to ask. And I kind of was like, when Dave told me his question, I was kind of like, I don't know, but okay, we'll give it a shot. So Tony, Dave wanted to know, if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be?
Well, since there's a Canadian influence here, I'd say it'd be a maple tree.
I think that's a good choice.
Nice.
Yeah. Even though your Leafs, boy, that was hard. That was a hard loss in the playoffs there, buddy.
Yeah. Let's not go down that. That was a long time ago. That was a long time ago now.
That's true. Okay.
All right. So, Tony, I want to ask you, you and I have known each other, geez, I forget now, probably more than 30 years, I guess. I don't know, a long time. No, it'd probably be, I think I weaseled my way into your layout in the 80s. I was on vacation in the Poconos, and I think I weaseled my way into your layout in the 80s. and which I'm sure you probably got a picture of it somewhere. You don't remember any of that, do you?
Well, you just made it. Actually, the Gold Spike was driven. We're talking clear back to the Allegheny Midland, and the Gold Spike was driven in, I think, 1980. So I don't know how developed it was by the time you got there, but it lasted until we never quite figured this out, whether it was December 1999 or December of 2000 when it came down. It was one of those two. So you'd have to tell me more than I can how developed it was when you stopped by.
There were some of the iconic scenes that had appeared in Model Railroader were there, and it was fully operational. And so there was, I would say, was maybe 50% of the scenery was done.
Oh, okay.
Does that sound about right? I'm guessing it was somewhere in the mid to late 80s that I literally weaseled my way in. I think I kept bugging you, and I'm a huge fan, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I'm from Canada, but I'm going to be in the Poconos. Any chance I could come by? And, you're like, go away, kid. Don't bother me. And I'm... So I don't want to ask you the typical questions. We'll get to the typical questions. But I want to know, first off, this is a really interesting thought I had today, Dave.
Here we go.
I've noticed lately that more people we interview on this podcast, more and more of them, their dad was in the hobby, or their dad is in the hobby. And I started to realize, my dad didn't get into the hobby until I wanted to when I was 8 or 9 or 10 years old, so which would have made my dad in his 40s. And I think more and more people are influenced by their family. And Tony, when do you remember how you got interested in the hobby?
Well, it wasn't my dad. He never had any interest in the hobby at all. In fact, he hated the nickel plate.
Really? Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, he managed a brickyard, and he saw the nickel plate Berks as these great big black battering rams that came backing off the main line and crashing into his boxcars with neatly stacked bricks and sending them flying. So he and the nickel plate claim agent apparently were on a first name basis, and that was his extent of the nickel plate. He did take a trip on the nickel plate from west central Indiana down to St. Louis on business. And I never found out about this until, 100 years later. But he wouldn't have been able to take me with him anyway. But it was my mom, who was a bit of a steam fan, it turns out. She liked the reciprocating business with all the side rods flashing and all that. Had no interest in diesels whatsoever. And she tells me that as a kid, we were down in Louisiana, somewhere around New Orleans during the war, when I was age 0 to a couple of years old. And I guess as Texas, New Orleans went by whatever accommodations we had. And every time a train went by, I'd run to the window. And I had memories of an uncle in Des Moines, Iowa, we were in southern Iowa for a while. I was born in Iowa, northern Iowa. And we were down at my mom's family's farm in southern Iowa. And they wanted to go shopping, so they foisted me off with an uncle in Des Moines. And I remember being taken to a roundhouse, or at least a promontory where we could see the roundhouse, and all the steam engines and that. So I kind of wondered if he was a rail fan. And in later years, I got a chance to go back and visit with my uncle. And I asked him about that. I said, were you a rail fan? Did you, take me down there? Because I thought maybe that was a big influence. Oh, no, I had nothing whatsoever to do with that. He says, you were just this obnoxious little kid that said, take me to see trains, So I guess we're inoculated with that gene at some point, or it carries over. And so I kind of wondered about it with my kids, but I took a hands-off approach. We had 2 boys and 2 girls, and I figured if they were as interested as I was, that they would come poking into the basement. And I actually recruited our oldest boy to help me draw lines. I'd hold the bent stick, and Dave would draw the pencil line in it. And if there's anything that would discourage you from being a model railroader, that's probably it, is helping your old man draw lines on Homosote or plywood. And that cured him of model railroading. But one day I was under the benchwork, and I already had the masonite hardboard skirting up, so you couldn't tell I was under the benchwork doing some wiring. And our youngest boy escorted some of his buddies in to see the railroad. And I just kept quiet as a church mouse. And John explained to them a couple things. First, that death was as close as touching the railroad, and they should keep their hands to themselves. But then he gave them an extremely lucid explanation of the whole thing. This is Allegheny Midland. And I had no idea that he'd been paying that close attention to it. And he later told me that if we'd had DCC and sound, I did have command control, Dynatrol, the analog, and it did have steam sound, but not diesel sound, but and no whistles and no bells, none of the fancy stuff. But he said if we'd had all that stuff, it might have sucked him into it. And his son, Jordan, who's now a college graduate, he was the same way I was. From the instant Jordan came down with Mom and Dad from Boston to visit, and the Allegheny Midland was still up then, it was just, that's all he wanted to do, was Grandpa's trains. It was exactly the same thing as with me as a kid. And there was no introducing him to it or anything else, just show it to him, and boy, that was it. And from the time he could walk, whenever they came down to visit, he was down in the basement with me, dragging around a bar stool so he could sit up on the bar stool wherever I was and get a better view. And when the Midland came down and the nickel plate started going up, and there was, 4 or 8 feet of test track there, he was the one up there with a Digitrax Zephyr power, little controller, test running some locomotives, and they ran exactly the speed you'd expect to see on a test run. And to this day, even though he's now, out of college, he's still a rail fan and a modeler. So I have no idea how you get people involved in the hobby and keep them involved or whatever. Our oldest daughter told me one time that it was a little encouragement. She could have been involved in the hobby, but I didn't offer it, and that was my mistake.
So do you have any kind of a sense? So that's pretty cool that your grandson is still interested in the hobby. What's his name?
Jordan Custer.
Custer. Well, that's a coincidence. That's your last name.
Yeah, well, he could have been on one of the maternal side,
That's true. So what do you have any sense? I've asked people this question before, and I'm fascinated by it. And your story is pretty cool because, like you say, you had 4 kids. They only sort of had a passing interest at any one time, but yet there's a grandson now that's very interested in it. Do you have any sense at all, after all these years, what it is about trains that draws people in, or have you never really been? I've never been able to answer that question, and the only thing I can ever think is it's, trains are so romantic. The ribbon of rail going off into the sunset and stuff like that. I mean, that's the only. What about you, Dave? Have you ever thought of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different aspects of it that are compelling. And I certainly agree with the rails into the sunset idea. I mean, that's some of my first passion from trains was Trains Magazine. And I've always loved the glint shot. I mean, that's always, there's a drama to that I think draws people in. But what's neat about the railroading hobby, at least as far as I can see it from where I sit these days, and this is something Tony and I have actually talked about, is that the layers of the hobby, you can take this hobby as far as you'd like to go. The hobby will always teach you more if you want to learn more. And conversely, if you're comfortable where you are and you enjoy collecting or you enjoy scratch building kits or resin kits or whatever niche of the hobby you love, any one of those niches can entertain you for the rest of your time. It's really a dynamic hobby, I think, that carries, you've got the model builders, you've got the historians like Rich Wisniewski, who just loves the history and the the connections. You've got the Jack Trapakinos of the world, who's, he's been to Tony's. He's a regular here, obviously, on the OC, on a cutoff, and Tony's been here as well, actually. So Jack is a rail service planner. He sees the connections between the service and how you turn the equipment to represent different trains. It's what he does professionally, but it's also one of his favorite parts of the hobby. And so that's one of the cool things, I think, and Tony, certainly, with a timetable and train order railroad like you have, it's one of the best adaptations that I've seen of that system, because the railroad fits the operating scheme, and you really do get a feeling that there's enough empty space and enough running by yourself that you're on your own, and you have to figure out what's going on. So I guess the typical Dave Abel's long answer to a short question, but lots of different ways to go. It's a big hobby.
Okay, so hey, Mike Hoke, it's Hoke. I think it's Hoke. Mike, I'm sure it's Mike. Pull over to the side of the road, buddy, and so you can get through it. Anyways, it's Mike is a retired Navy doctor in Erie, Pennsylvania, with a beautiful layout, and he's a big fan of both you guys. So he sent us an email that I had read them ago. He didn't mention anybody in particular, but the words long-winded perhaps may have been.
Oh, just a bit. You got to tell the background.
So anyways, Tony, what do you think it is about railroading that makes it become this hobby and this passion for people where they just can't leave it alone? Like I can even think of, there's a fellow named Walker Embry who was insistent that he was leaving the hobby. And after a few months, the thing with this hobby is it's like being in organized crime. Like every time I try to get out, they drag me back in. What do you think it is, Tony?
That's a very interesting question, and I don't have an easy answer for that.
Hold on. Are some of our questions not been interesting?
Well,
that's honest. There you go.
I'm usually not at a loss for words, but that one, that's a tough one. There's so many facets, as Dave was talking about. It's broad-shouldered, a term I often use, and there's just something about it that appeals to so many different people. And I think if you talk to 100 different people, you'd probably get at least 50, if not 100 different answers. I think one of the things that's so appealing about it is that it's a model building hobby, very much like building model airplanes, but yet it's not static. You don't finish, a model of the Titanic or the Bismarck or something, PT-109 or something like that, or a Mustang or a Corsair, and then you put it on the mantelpiece or in a glass case, and that's the end of it. We have the dynamic aspect of it where we can actually model the other dimension of the hobby, and that is that once we get all this stuff done, we can make it move. Now, I think that one of the things that we don't do very well yet is animation. Maybe the guys who model circuses or something with the Ferris wheel and stuff like that have been doing it for years. But little simple things like windmills going around and the grasshopper type pumps and things like that, oil wells and that kind of thing. There's just little things we can do to add a little animation to the railroad. Now we're beginning to get vehicles that do some very interesting things. I think the Germans over in Nuremberg have shown us that there's a lot of possibilities that we're overlooking, but of course those guys are borderline certifiable, I think, with what they've been doing there. But they've made a whole different thing out of it, and it's got to be commercialized to be doing it at that level. There's got to be an income stream, but I think that one of the greatest things about our hobby is just that it's an animated hobby to a very large extent. Now you can make the case that you can take model airplanes out and fly them, but I'm a pilot, and I can tell you that flying model airplanes and flying big airplanes it's very much related, but the model airplanes have a very different dynamic than the big airplanes. They're way overpowered, and you can do things with them in terms of G-forces and stuff that you just can't do with a big airplane. So it's not kind of a one-to-one thing. Now, again, we can do the same thing with our model trains. We can stop them on a dime. So, you could argue this back and forth all day, but the point is that we can, through momentum and setting a lot of momentum and, through training and teachings and things like that, we can do a very respectable job of emulating the prototype and actually running a simulation of what happens on a big railroad. Whereas I think when you go out to fly a model airplane, that's not really your objective. You're not trying to fly a 747 from Boston to Chicago. That's not your objective at all. You're just trying to say, please, God, don't let me wreck this thing that I spent the last 5 years building.
Yeah, and I guess the operating session side of it would be a little difficult too. You hear about the model dogfights and the guys that this and what's amazing too, at least in my view, with some of the model aircraft is you get guys that are building 1/8 scale jets, F-14A Tomcats or A-10 Warthogs, and the videos are out there on YouTube. And they're just these spectacular machines. But there's, if you have a small accident in a model railroad operating session, well, you pick it up, you put it back on the track, and you figure it out. You have a small accident with a 1/8 scale A-10. It's a different game. It's a different level.
It's called re-kitting it. There was a guy, I wish I remember his name, but Jim Boyd and I went down to Valley Forge to photograph a model airplane meet when I was at Karstens, and Jim was helping out with model airplane magazine, and this guy had a Koester, and it was so realistic that he had the seatbelts with the dirt marks on the seatbelts where the guy's hands would grab them. I mean, it was just Bob Carlson. That was his name.
This is one of the F4Us, the propeller, like the end of World War II Corsair, or the jet?
Oh yeah. Yeah, the radial engines.
Yeah,
the round engines.
So awesome.
And, the paint was worn off on the edges of the panels. I mean, it was just fabulous. But he set the carburetor just a little lean, and he took off, and you could tell the engine wasn't running right. So he immediately got back in the pattern and was set up on final, and it just quit. And, landed short, and it was in a bunch of pieces.
Oh.
And, all I could say is if I were doing that stuff, I'd have a 45 caliber pistol in my toolbox and shoot myself.
My God.
It'd be like scratch building a big boy or a nickel plate Burke and then dropping it on the floor from 10 feet and going, oh, well,
Yeah, thousands of hours down the tubes. It's like some of these live steam guys that put in, it was a picture floated across the internet, I don't know, about a year ago, of a New York Central Dreyfuss Hudson that somebody's having built for them. One of these absolute works of art, custom machined, to run on an 8-inch gauge, live steam railroad. And holy moly, it's a different level. But at least those stay on the ground.
I went to college at Purdue, and there was a guy there named Jim Kreider that was a mechanical engineer. And he said when he graduated, he was going to make all the castings for an 1.5-inch scale nickel plate Burke. Sure you are, And one day, 10 years or so after I was out of school, I saw a live steam nickel plate Burke. And I asked the guy where he got all the parts for that. And he said, some guy named Jim Kreider made all the parts. So Jim actually came through. Jim's still a good friend to this day. And in fact, he's writing an article for me. I also produced the Nickel Plate Society's magazine, and I think that's a legitimate story for the magazine. So I don't know whether that's prototype modeling or model railroading, but that's a whole different deal. I mean, you want to get into that side of the hobby, you better be prepared for. That's $100,000 investment right off the bat, and if you're going to do timetable and turn order operation, you need 10 of those and 10 mics and 400 freight cars and a ranch,
right? And 100 acres exactly, and then a track crew and an actual B&B crew.
I participated in those op sessions. There's one in Texas. There's one in Michigan. The big ranch with all the track. In Texas, you even get free rattlesnakes. And it's a lot of fun, but it's just nuts. I mean, it's way beyond me.
I just discovered there's a place in Ohio called the Mill Creek Central, and it's just massive. It's actually, I've never been there, but I'm going there as soon as I can just to see it. Go ahead.
I was going to say, check out Train Mountain up in Oregon.
Yeah.
That's another one it's on train orders all the time. And and again, you get it's almost reminds you a little bit of the G gauge crowd, the Garden Railroad crowd, where they don't necessarily stick to a certain prototype because there's so few models available in those scales that almost everything's custom. So everybody does what their heart wants to follow. And you get a nickel plate Burke with, ABA daylight F units next to a, 1/8 gauge Rio Grande narrow gauge Mikado that runs on the same track, but of course is much larger because it models the narrow gauge. And so, and they just, they make it work. But it's different ways of doing the same thing.
That Mill Creek may be the one in Michigan, Lionel. You might check that.
Okay. All right. What you really need to check out is a guy named Adam Pinellas in Mapleton, Utah. This guy he's building I think he said he's got a half acre, and he's turning it into a Disney World of live steam. He's just one of the most talented guys I've ever met.
In a half acre?
Yeah, in a half acre. You should see what this guy's doing. He's also a conductor on the California Zephyr. He's also was a locomotive engineer that ran helper units across Soldier Summit, and on and on and on.
Wow.
So anyways, when do you think, Tony, it was the first time what was your first train set or trains that you got? Do you remember how old you were?
Yes, I do. That was kind of a big deal, in fact, although I don't remember it so much, but it's been chronicled. When I was just after the war, Dad had come home, and of course, the supplies of anything were kind of limited. And Sears stocked Lionel train sets, and Dad had ordered a Lionel train set for me. And this was in Sheffield, Iowa, which is near Mason City in north central Iowa, where we lived. And the train set didn't come, and it didn't come, and it didn't come. And there was a guy named Archie Gam, I think was his name, was the assistant postmaster. And Dad, of course, was bugging this guy all the time as the train set come in. And hadn't come in. And finally, Christmas Eve, forget it. But late Christmas Eve, Dad got a phone call from the post office. And this is a little town. I mean, it's not the size of Barrie, Ontario or something. It's a small town. And probably not even as big as Newton, New Jersey, where I live. And the assistant postmaster said, Mr. Custer, come on, or probably Ray by this time. Ray, come on down. Your train set's here. And Dad went down to the post office and picked it up and just couldn't thank him enough. And the postmaster assistant said, well, boy has to have his Christmas. And it was one of those 2 6.4s, one of those never was steam engines, wheel arrangements. I still have it, and I'll bet it'd still run. So that's what got me going. And I later had a 4x8 with 027 track on it. And that segued into junior high school years into a Super O when Lionel made that track with that strip of copper for the center rail. Looked a lot better in plastic ties that were realistic and spaced correctly, distance apart. And I had that until I was almost in high school or something in my bedroom. And by that time we lived up in Long Beach, which is a suburb of Michigan City. Our house was right on Lake Michigan, which was a neat place to live. And that's where I went to high school, was Michigan City. And then down to Purdue and Lafayette. And so I lived on a couple different branches of nickel plate, never on the main line, different lines of nickel plate, but never the main Chicago to Buffalo main line.
How did your dad and your parents end up in Michigan City?
Well, Dad, as I had mentioned, he was quite an individual. He in his teen years had taught in a one-room school in Iowa. He was the teacher, and then he went into banking. he was one of these guys that just had a facility for numbers. He had these things where you could add up, columns of 5-digit numbers, a big stack of numbers, add them up in his head and stuff. He just was one of those kind of people who could do that. And there's tricks to that. I mean, it's not all just genius level. There's ways of doing things like that, but he knew them. And then he went to work for the brickyard in Sheffield, Iowa, and they acquired a brickyard in Cayuga, Indiana. And so they sent him in 1951. They sent him out to Cayuga to manage that brickyard. And that was one of those please don't throw me into the briar patch deals, because in 1951 in Cayuga, the CN, Chicago and Eastern Illinois, ran north-south through there with diesels, all EMDs. But the nickel plate ran through there with all steam except for the 2 passenger trains, which ran behind a single Alco PA1. So it couldn't have gotten any better than that. And so we lived there till 1958. Steam had gone in 1955. But I got the last 4 years of steam and passenger trains behind PAs. So that was cool. But managing a brickyard was tough. And there was always labor issues and stuff like that. And so in 1958, Dad got a call, or in 57, he got a call from a guy in Chicago that ran a company that sold brick all over the Midwest. And he says, Mr. Custer, he says, how would you like it if I doubled your salary and gave you a commission and you wouldn't have to deal with labor unions anymore? Dad said, sign me up.
And the story.
So Dad took a job in Chicago, but his territory was northern Indiana. So we moved up to Long Beach with that house right on the lake, which was cool. And Dad did that until he got really, really tired of snow. So he, after we kids were all grown and gone, he put a snow shovel in the back window of the car and he drove south. So somebody said, what's that? And that was somewhere around Jacksonville, Florida, and he went to work down there doing exactly the same thing, but out of Jacksonville, Florida, and they stayed down there and also in the Tampa area until they died.
Wow. Now, when did you meet? Because I know at Purdue, you did the 4-year degree at Purdue. Is that where you met Bill Darnaby originally? Because I know you guys have been friends for a long, long time.
Yeah, I met Bill at the Purdue Railroad Club at Purdue. Bill was quite a few years behind me, so I was just going, I still lived in town because I worked for a small civil engineering company in Lafayette, ran the office for them. We did land surveys and stuff like that. And but I still went over to the Purdue Railroad Club. And while I was at the Purdue Railroad Club, while I was doing this civil engineering work, I noticed that Kalmbach had run an ad for somebody in the art department. So I went up to Milwaukee and interviewed for that job, and they said fine, and they made me an offer. But Milwaukee at that time was about the most expensive city in the United States when you compared income to cost.
Interesting. Okay.
Because it's, winter heating bills, stuff like that. It's a very expensive place to live. And I said, I'm sorry, I can't afford to come up here for that. And so then George Gloff, who was the art director at that time, called me back and he says, we'll make you an assistant art director. I said, you can make me vice president of art, but I can't come up there for that money. And so I thought that was the end of my career in the model railroad industry. And I had also discovered that there was no crossover between the art department and the editorial department, and my interest was more in the editorial department. Now, while I was at Purdue, I had discovered that my interests and talents were far more in writing and communication than they were in engineering. As an electrical engineer, my main accomplishment in life probably would have been to electrocute myself, and so I almost made a career out of the Air Force. That was going well. I wound up as the commander of the honorary unit of the Purdue Air Force Wing there, and Judy was president of the Cadet Wives. So we were doing real well with that. But there was some issues, economic issues that prevented us from following through on that. We were raising kids at the time, and as a couple of married students, it just wasn't going to work out. So we had to back away from all those great plans. But so I made mark time as a doing civil engineering work, which was child's play. That wasn't hard stuff. And meanwhile, I got this idea for Railfan magazine. So in about the time I was involved in getting 759 going again, and so that was September of '68. So I made an appointment to go out and see Hal Carstens in October '68 when we were running the 759 down the Hudson River, and he was in Ramsey at that time, New Jersey. And so I stopped in and saw him, and they were on Arch Street. They weren't in the famous Ramsey Journal building on the main drag there near the Erie. They moved down several blocks away to former central office building. Nice brick building, really nice building, but it wasn't that famous building that AHM had a kit for or anything. And so I talked to him about this idea about Railfan magazine. And he said, well, that's an interesting idea. And he pulled a file folder out of his drawer labeled Railfan magazine. And so he'd had the same idea, but he said, I don't think the timing is right now for doing that. And I said, well, okay, the interview's over. But as I got up to leave, I said, if you need any help with Railroad Model Craftsman, let me know. I'd be interested. He said, well, I'm looking for an associate editor right now. So I went back home. This is October, and I turned around and flew back out in November. First flight I'd ever had in a TWA DC-9. And that was cool. And liked what I saw. So then Judy and I drove out and looked around. And northern New Jersey was a lot different than what I'd expected. I'd expected the Meadowlands, and here in northern New Jersey and stuff was a very pretty, interesting area. Hal had a home in Upper Saddle River. His neighbor was Pat Summerall, the famous place kicker for the Giants.
For the Giants, absolutely. Yep.
And another neighbor was Charlie Miller. Charlie Miller is not a name you probably know, but he's president of Testers. You might know his daughter, Susan St. James, the famous actress. So,
okay, now you're just pulling
Kate
our leg.
Nelly or something like that.
Oh, wow.
Now you're just pulling our leg. Come on.
So, Upper Saddle River was kind of a nice place to live.
New Jersey's the place to be, Lionel. You got to come down and check it out.
Yeah.
So what?
Particularly that corner. So that's how I got my job at Railroad Model Craftsman.
That's a cool story.
'69.
I didn't realize you'd gone for Railfan first, and then Railroad Model Craftsman is what presented itself, and boy, the rest is history. That's amazing.
So, briefly, what was Purdue Model Railroad Club like in the '60s? Like, can you give us an idea of like what the club was like? So you met Bill Darnaby sometime in the mid to late '60s.
Yeah, Bill Darnaby. There were several people there that went on to greater fame. Bill Wisher became a vice president of Walthers. He's still there. Jim Schwinkendorf went on to lead the STEAM program at Burlington Northern.
Wow.
So we had several alums that came out of that did pretty well in the railroad industry or model railroad industry.
So okay, let me ask you this question, Dave. I think this is going to be
Here we go.
I think this is one of those questions where people are going to be going, I've listened to about 6,000 hours of this, and finally.
I've been waiting.
Yeah. So, okay, so you're involved in the Purdue Model Railroad Club in the 60s, and you go off to be a magazine editor. Now I can't remember the whole question. But I want to know, what was it like? What was the Model Railroad Club like? Like you didn't have... Did the hobby seem... This is the question. I just remembered it, Dave. Did the hobby seem in the 60s? This is kind of going to your question, Dave. Maybe I need to credit you with the question. By the way, a little aside before we get to that question. That day when Tony's dad finally did get the train set on Christmas Eve, and he got it all set up, and Tony and the family and everybody, he had a wonderful Christmas day. Little side note, anecdote. That evening on Christmas Day, while they're all having Christmas dinner and chowing down on turkey, little Tony turns to his dad and says, "Gosh, Dad, someday I wish I would like to meet a person named Lion."
Oh God, I hope that didn't make you forget the real question.
Yeah. So the real question,
come on,
the real question is, what did it seem like now that you're many years, many decades down the road? What did the hobby seem like to you at that time? I don't know. Help me describe this question, Dave. What was the hobby like? Did it seem as active and full of energy like it does today? Like, were you guys living in this kind of bubble of, you had this really cool club, the Purdue Model Railroad Club, and you guys were having tons of fun with it, and the hobby just seemed like, man, I want to do this forever? Or was it like, what was the feeling of the? Can you take us back to what it was like to be in the Purdue Model Railroad Club in the 60s?
Yeah, I think I can. And I can describe the club in one phrase, and I can also tell you what it left us feeling like. The club had an upper loop and a lower loop. And that is a death sentence for any model railroad design. If you start in the lower loop and you run around for a while and you wind up in the upper loop, that kind of tells you that you didn't understand track planning. And what the hobby needed at that point was Allen McClelland. And fortunately, Allen McClellan had, about that time, had been working in the background. And this is towards the late 60s, and the V&O was cranking along, and none of us really understood it well. But there's this great story that ties us all together that I didn't find out about for a little while, but not very many years after this. We tried to do things to the Purdue Railroad Club to make it more interesting, but none of us really got staging yet. We hadn't really wrapped our brains around staging. We'd done some things to fix the obvious mistakes. I mean, the thing was just double tracked the whole time, so you couldn't really operate it. There weren't industries, there weren't towns, there weren't places to stop. It was just this place to come down and run your trains. So it was the typical model railroad club, probably of the 50s and 60s, probably even back into the 40s. John Armstrong went to school there too, but he was a member of the O-Scale Club that was in a different building. And I've never seen a plan for that club. I don't know whether he had a hand in that club's design or not. I don't think he had anything to do with the HO club that I was a member of. The HO club had a elevated mezzanine that overlooked the club, and there were 4 separate control panels. And there was a dispatcher that set up there with a big board with a rotary switch for each block. So the rotary switch had 4 positions on it for each block. And it's cab 1, cab 2, cab 3, and cab 4. So if I'm running cab 1, and I had to memorize where the block limits were, so I would holler out to him, cab 1 into block 3, which may or may not be translated into, as he grabbed it, cab 3 into block 1 instead of cab 1 into block 3. So pretty soon somebody's got my train. And, it was a disaster. So one summer, while everybody was home and nobody could vote on anything, Dick Cluse and I rewired the whole thing so that there was a pair of phone jacks, and you just leapfrog from one circuit to another, and you plugged and chugged your way along. With 2 phone jacks, you plugged into the block you were in and the block you were going to go in next, and chugged your way along. And each of the 4 engineers had that. No way to screw it up, no way to have somebody not have your train or anything. So we fixed that, but it was still just a place to run your trains.
Okay, I got a question. So did you say this in the mezzanine, it had like 4 separate control panels? Is that what you?
Yeah, I mean 4 separate cabs, not
right.
control panels.
Okay, 4 separate cabs. How big was this thing? How big was this club?
Well, it probably was 15 by 30 or something like that.
Okay, so pretty decent size.
Yeah, it's pretty decent size, but you're sitting at one end looking out over this thing like King Midas or something. I mean, just as stupid as you can make. It was almost as bad as the guy sitting in a room on a chair with the trains running around him. The old.
In hindsight, sure, and this is one of the things. This is fascinating because I'm excited to hear how Allen's influence, ergonomically looks at the space and goes from running trains from King Midas's throne. It's a great analogy, Tony. Looking at it, standing up over the thing and looking down across this vast valley of model trains that go in a big loop. And they do their thing. And it's cool. It's like a North Lance, down here in New Jersey, where people come to watch trains run or to run their trains. But Allen, I think, and you've said this before, your Trains of Thought column has really been insightful, I think, in the last couple of years as you've started to push some of the more philosophical decisions that have affected things in your time. And the way you look at Allen McClelland and the 7 things that he brought to model railroading that you considered revolutionary. It was was it last month's Model Railroader that was published?
Yeah.
But it was a fantastic slice. And I'm excited to hear, to hear the fact that that's not a huge layout. That's not a huge, in the grand scheme of things. And yet, Custer, Darnaby, Armstrong. These are big names. I didn't realize Armstrong went to Purdue. So did Allen, was he aware of the club or was he operating separately? And then you guys found out about it through the hobby press.
Was Allen aware?
Yeah, he means did you guys, when you guys were at Purdue, when did Allen McClellan, when did you become aware of Allen McClellan?
Well, okay. Allen, this is kind of an interesting story.
All right, time out. We have a rule here on the old AML. Like I said earlier, I know you've listened to the podcast and most of them twice, but we have a very definite and hard, fast rule. You tell the story, and then Dave and I will decide if it's interesting.
Oh, all right. This is a potentially interesting story.
I love it, Tony. The first time I got asked that question, there was 6 seconds of silence because I didn't know what to say. Well done.
When I went to Railroad Model Craftsman in 1969, the first thing I expected to just be a go for coffee type for a couple of years, but what the truth was that Hal had a company to run, and he founded Creative Crafts Magazine and had that to manage and stuff. And so, here, kid, put out the magazine. And fortunately, I had founded the Nickel Plate Society and had learned all the paste up and all the stuff in the hot wax days and that. So I knew how to produce things. And I had won national awards for writing and stuff. So I knew my way around the block and all that stuff. But I didn't know how they got material, so I just assumed that there was these file cabinets full of great material. And so I went there and I went to the file cabinet and started going through it. And I think I went through 3 or 4 drawers and found 2 or 3 articles of good material. And, I remember one was Bob Fink out of Dayton had written one about a concrete coal dock. And I think I had Jim Burge draw up the plans for the coal dock, and we were in business. But, I learned very quickly that you don't sit by the mailbox and wait for things to come in. So then I discovered, what I did was made a list of what talent we had coming in the door. And we had Fran Hayden, and John Allen had done some stuff. We had a rule not to rate MR's authors. In other words, if you had written for MR, like Bill McClanahan, but not for us, we did not contact you. That was the rule. And until Bill McClanahan entered the RMC Dremel kit bashing contest, I couldn't even contact him. But McClellan had written for RMC. And there were these little photo stories of, a couple of Athearn F7s and this dip blue paint schemes trailing a whole bunch of hoppers through these Appalachian forests with these plain Jane depots, and it just looked right, very, very realistic, with absolutely cheapo equipment and a simple paint scheme, no masking or anything, but it looked like the B&O, and I thought, man, this guy is really onto something. So I got a hold of Allen, and I said, I think I'd like you to do more for the magazine and all that stuff. And Allen said, well, he says, I thought maybe he'd blow me off. He said, the only reason I write for Hal is I need $10, and he's an easy mark, But what Allen said was that, Hal really appreciates my material. When I send him a package, he prints everything verbatim. He prints every photo and all the text and all the captions. Whereas if I send it to Model Railroader, they only take like one of the photos and one of the captions and print it in their photo section, trackside photos. Well, what was actually happening was it wasn't Hal being perceptive at all. It was when the package came in the door, Hal was so busy running the company, he just threw it on the art director's desk, who was this woman named Viola Capps that didn't know anything about railroading. And since she didn't know anything about it, she got this package and she just take all the photos and all the text and all the captions and lay it out and make an article out of it. So the whole premise of what Allen was seeing at RMC that made him favor RMC over Model Railroader was false, but it worked in my favor. So about this time, a year or so had gone by in 1971, Hal was thinking in the background that he needed some help. He'd bought Flying Models magazine. He needed a managing editor. And he was kind of rail banking Jim Boyd in his back of his mind for the day when Railfan magazine might actually come to fruition. So he hired Jim Boyd and put him to work as managing editor of Flying Models. And so Jim immediately agreed with me. We were buddies out in the Midwest, so we already knew each other. Jim agreed with me about the V&O that this McClellan guy really knew what was going on. So I got the idea of taking my nickel plate Burke and making fan trips like was going on in real life with 759. I'd ship this Burke around with Hal's business car Ramsey, and we'd run fan trips on a bunch of the famous model railroads. And by this time, I'd been able to get enough credibility for RMC that some of the more famous model railroaders had let us in the door now.
All right. Whoa. Just hang on there. Let's pack that bus up a couple of stops. So you came up with the idea you had a model of 759, and you came up with the idea to stick this thing in a box and ship it around to other model railroads of the day that were well-known model railroads of the day and have a fan. I vaguely remember that. I remember seeing that. That was a heck of an idea. Like how many?
Well, let us do things all over again. In other words, even if we had a feature article on a guy's railroad, we could do another one.
Yeah.
Like McClellan,
That was before. That's before your time, Dave.
No, but it's a great. You're right. I mean, it's totally. I wasn't born until 1977. It's way before my time. But that said, I have a couple of those back issues, and I've even seen a couple pictures of that. And to hear the backstory is fascinating. It really is.
See, this is what I wanted to do with Tony. I wanted to get into all the other stuff. This is what we're getting the good stuff now.
The old school, yeah.
Yeah, you only get that on the Griffin show. Okay, so Carrie, all right. So now you're descending this. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you're saying a lot of really cool stuff. And just so everybody knows, when Tony refers to 759. It was a nickel plate locomotive. It was a Class S2 284 Berkshire type steam locomotive, built in 1944 by the Lima Locomotive Works in Lima, Ohio. Okay.
Lima, Ohio.
Lima. Yep. Oh, that's a capital sin there for the Midwesterners.
Is it decal or decal?
That's like calling Newark. I mean, you gotta be careful.
That's like calling Lebanon. Yeah.
Only if you're from Pennsylvania.
Yeah, exactly.
I was driving down to Reading, Pennsylvania one day, and when I was at Bell Labs and the successor company, Bell Communications Research, and I was the founding editor of the Science magazine, and we were on press in Reading, and I was driving down near Reading, and the announcer came on, and he says, the temperature today in Reading and Lancaster are for you tourists in the area, Reading and Lancaster.
Yeah, Central Pennsylvania's got it. They have their own pronunciations. My brother lives out in York County, went to Millersville University, and it's Lancaster.
Yeah,
Lancaster and Lebanon and Bethlehem. Yeah, they're very particular.
So, anyways,
yeah, no. Back to the topic at hand. So at this point, then, and this is you're still you're opening doors at Railroad Model Craftsman with the idea of a nickel plate Berkshire on tour doing the fan trips. Obviously, it got to Allen McClelland's layout for a second article on the Virginian in Ohio. What other layouts did you guys send it to at the time?
Well, it got to Jim Payne, who was also the Durham and Southern. He was in Kettering, Ohio, which is next door to Dayton. It got to, by this time, Bill McClanahan had entered the RMC Dremel Kit Bashing Award, which happened when we used to have a huge hobby show, the Hobby Industry Association at the Hilton in Chicago, which at that time was the biggest hotel in the world. And a guy named Ed Erdman of Dremel approached me. I don't know whether he had approached Kalmbach and got rebuffed, but he came up to me and he said, we'd like to have some kind of an award or something. And I said, well, how about the RMC Dremel Kit Bashing Award? We give away a Dremel tool and some cash for people who enter creative models. And he said, sold. And as far as I know, that still goes on, or maybe they discontinued it. But anyway, that's how that got started.
Yeah, it still goes. If I'm not mistaken, it's still going on. Yeah, it's a great idea.
So Bill McClanahan had entered that. So we were able to do that. Now, that then opened the door. Well, I'm trying to remember whether we did it on the Gory and Defeated or not. I'd have to look back to see where also, and it went around. I got to tell you a McClanahan story. Bill McClanahan, of course, was famous for the scenery book that he did for Kalmbach. I then had made arrangements to do an article on the Texas and Rio Grande Western, and made arrangements to fly down to Dallas. But, I'm like a 28 or 30-year-old kid, and McClanahan had this vision of journalists, and particularly photographer-type journalists. And I didn't find this out for several years from Jim Finley, who used to do a Letters from Jim column in Model Railroader that was hilarious. Jim was an Army major that was in Japan. He did a lot of the legwork for Bill. I can't remember his last name, for Pacific Fast Mail. He did a lot of the legwork over in Japan when he was there in the Army. But at any rate, McClanahan met me at the airport, and we had a good time. It turns out the guy was like my father. I mean, they were just almost clones. So we just hit it right off. Bill's railroad was up in an attic in Texas. So you had the sloping ceilings and the heat and all that stuff. Not a pleasant place to shoot photos, but we got a cover story out of it. But I later found out that if I had gotten off that airplane with a ponytail, Bill was going to just put me on the next airplane back to Newark. And that was the end of the whole deal. These Texas conservatives are pretty set in their ways. I don't think we went to Cliff Robinson's. Cliff was a wonderful, wonderful guy. Cliff had the MUT lines, the Marquette Union Terminal lines. There was a NMRA Heritage car done for his railroad. Cliff got to be a good buddy. This is taking a diverging route here, but it's a great story about Cliff. Cliff was very hard of hearing, and he would always rent a suite. He was very wealthy, Dallas electrical contractor, and he'd always rent a suite at NMRA conventions and had any kind of booze you wanted or anything like that. But it took me some years to figure out why he did that. The reason he did that was to get everybody up to a quiet suite instead of having to meet him down in the bar where he couldn't hear anything in a conversation. And I wore hearing aids, so, I figured out what he was doing. And when he came up to operate on the Allegheny Midland, he wanted to operate the short line. and I hadn't really developed it to any great extent, and I was kind of embarrassed about the whole thing. But it dawned on me why, because if you ran on the main line, you had to wear a radio headset. And it was not long after that I suddenly dawned on me that we were going to ban radio headsets forevermore on the next railroad I built, which is the case, because they're problematic for some people. But at any rate, when we had the big hobby show down in Dallas, we got the word one morning early that a representative from Railroad Model Craftsman and from Model Railroader were going to do the morning show, like Good Morning America show on CBS or NBC or ABC. And so I was the guy from Model Craftsman, and Jim Hediger was the guy from Model Railroader. And of course, we're good buddies.
Wow, this is great.
So we headed down to the TV studio, and I had done some radio and television in college, so this was no big deal for me. I was fine with it. But Jim Hediger was looked like a deer caught in the headlights. And so Jim had worn cowboy boots, and I'm wearing a blazer and stuff. But I thought Jim was sucking up with those cowboy boots. but we got to the studio, and the first question I asked was, "Who's going to interview us?" And they pointed to the guy down in a gym down there that was doing a handball thing. And I says, "Does he know anything about trains?" And they said, "Yeah, he's got a train set and that stuff." So I began to relax a little bit. But as we got close to airtime, it was pretty clear that he was still doing that handball thing. And so I said, "I don't think he's going to be interviewing us." And they said, "No, she is. And here's this sweet young thing that's still dripping wet out of her journalism degree." And so we sat down on the Johnny Carson couch there, and I told Hediger, I said, "Just stay with me." And that did not ease his pain at all, and because he knew me too well. So we sat down, and she says, "So what brings you to Dallas?" And I said, "Well, there's this big hobby show down at the convention center." And she said, "Yes, I'm aware of that." And I said, she says, "So what's happening down there?" And I said, "Well, it's not open to the public. It's just for people in the profession, but all the hobbies are represented from crafts to planes and trains, model boats, model airplanes, and all that stuff." I said, "But both of us represent the model railroad side, and that's what we're most capable of talking about." And she said, "Oh, could you tell me more about that?" And I said, "Well, about model railroading, it's where we have a Christmas tree, and we set up a loop of track around the tree, and we run our trains around Christmas time." Oh, yeah, she knew all about that. So I said, "But, it's gotten to be a year-round hobby, and what's really new in the hobby is technology." I said, "Now we have these super glues, and the biggest problem we've always had is that the needles fall off the tree, and the tree turns brown, but now we have these super glues, we can glue the needles back on, and we have these odorless latex paints that we can spray the tree and keep it green year-round, so we can run our trains all year round." Well, she thought that was just spiffy. So at any rate, we got out of there with our skins intact, and we're laughing in the cab back to the hotel. Cliff Robinson was about 5 feet tall, maybe 5'2", with great big ears, great big, beer mug type handle ears. And so Jim and I got in the elevator and went down to the lower convention floor level, and we stepped out of the elevator, and Cliff Robinson is standing right there in front of us, and we skidded to a stop. He's got his hands on his hips, and we just froze. We thought we were going to get the damn Yankees lecture. And he leaned forward to talk to us, so we leaned forward to be sure we heard what he had to say. And he said, "She's had that coming for quite some time."
See,
anyway, digression.
It's fascinating. For the hobby to take you to in a major U.S. city onto the national network of a TV show. I think that's one of the things that I, as we go through the talk tonight, that I really find fascinating is, the hobby there's so much energy out there. There's so much static that you hear about how the hobby's getting older, and it's, less people are interested, and it's not growing, and it's going to fade away. And you hear stories about, two guys from the major magazines being on, a regular news show. It's like, wow, that would be news today, big time. But at the same time, certainly, my time's operating up on the cloverleaf on your layout, Tony, and other layouts in New Jersey, and of course, the interchange, and the one time I was able to get out and operate trains as part of the ProRail that happens I was down in Washington D.C. in 2018 when that happened. Like, these operating layouts are spectacular, and there's no shortage of new products from Broadway Limited and Walthers and Athearn and Scale Trains. There's new manufacturers. There's Rapido, which is doing world-class stuff. Atlas is still out there doing stuff. So there's a lot of places where it goes. How does your experience in those first few years at Railroad Model Craftsman with new products compare to what you're looking at today?
That was just kind of a kickoff of innovation. I mean, even going back further than that, I clearly remember Dad buying me an Atlas turnout kit with brass rail and fiber ties, and I'm thinking the hobby is doomed. I mean, no, this ain't going to work, and so FlexTrack debuted somewhere along in there, but then along came Globe with those F7A and B unit shells. I remember a trip to Danville, Illinois, into a hobby shop, and here I'm a Lionel guy, but I was beginning to smell out HO, and there was a Varney AB set of cast metal, white metal kit, and I'm thinking, how much could that cost, as small as it is? And it was like $35 or something like that. And I'm thinking, what, are they kidding? And it was just, there was this great disconnect between possibility and what was available. But then the Globe 98-cent, 89-cent AB set, no motor, of course, but I still have at least the B unit around here somewhere. And they were exquisite. I mean, nobody'd ever make a better one. Of course they did. But,
right, of course.
At that time, I mean, the detail was just out of this world. And then we began to get the plastic freight cars. And, of course, those were going to be the death of the hobby, according to the old-timers. A guy who ran the local movie theater in our little hometown in west central Indiana gave me I think it was a Varney kit for a Swift reefer. And I tried gluing the ladders on with Duco cement, and I discovered that everywhere you put a drop of Duco cement, it lifted the paint right off, just popped it right loose from the metal. So it just, all these things that the old veterans were whining about, to me, were the salvation of the hobby, that there was a great revolution coming. And we were talking earlier about McClellan and the Athearn units, which were dip blue paint. Well, those were actually the Globe shells.
Okay.
And he then, as Dave mentioned, the 7 things I wrote about, I think it was July, MR Trains of Thought. Allen was the first guy that I'm aware of, but at least the first guy to talk about it nationally, that put all these pieces together. I mean, all of us were struggling with the fact that this doesn't work. I mean, this is not getting us where we need to go. The Purdue Railroad Club with a double track main line going from the upper loop to the lower loop, well, that's not going to get you anywhere, and no staging. Allen didn't have it all figured out exactly, because he originally ran from Afton Yard, which was not staged, not fed by staging, really. When you left Afton Yard, you either went on the main line to the other end of the railroad, or you could duck off at Blackstone into a 2-track hidden staging yard that came out at Clintwood. But 2 tracks is not much. That's just like a subdivision that went off and came back on. So that's not much staging at all. And at the other end of the railroad at Elm Grove, there was, I think, 3 tracks in a loop for staging. So he hadn't really figured it out yet either. And until he extended the railroad beyond Elm Grove through Gage Pass to Indian Hill, into the dispatcher's office where there was a stub-ended staging yard, until he got to that point, he didn't really have the staging worked out, and he never did get it squared away on the Afton end because there was no way to do that. So the Afton end had to be kind of a combination visible and hidden, if you will, staging yard. But other than that, he was taking the abstract stuff apart and sticking it in 110-volt steel utility boxes and a great big heavy friggin' coiled cable you had to drag around in that. And I think I remember them getting pretty hot, but I may be wrong about that. But he figured out this business that you had to have walk-around control rather than shouting around back and forth about what your train limits are and that. He worked with Jerry Albers and Steve King to come up with a CTC system that was hardwired. I mean, deck after deck after deck.
Wow.
Of rotary switches. And for the most part, they work pretty well. And, he just didn't let technology or limitations, any of those things, that didn't enter into the equation. The equation was you had the answer first. We got to do this. And then now we'll figure out how we get to that answer. But the answer is not movable. We can't move the answer. We can't cheat on the answer. The answer is already given. So, and that was going on in the early to late 1960s. And it was 1970, I think the fall of 1970, when I first met Allen at an NMRA National in Pittsburgh, regional in Pittsburgh, and introduced myself to him. And the two of us left the hotel and went down to a bar, and neither one of us are drinkers. But we just wanted to get away and talk about stuff because we just instantly sensed that we were on the same wavelength, that he was doing what should be done and that I wanted to know everything that he was doing. And that started a friendship that continues right to this day. And it was critical to the V&O story because when finally it got to the point in the mid-1970s where it just occurred to me that we needed to lay out this blueprint for how you design and build a model railroad and then operate it. And I called Alan and I said, you know what we ought to do? And it was the first of many times when the minute you even hinted at it, Alan says, yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. And the same thing happened with the Appalachian lines later when Alan called me and he says, I think the V&O and the Allegheny Midland and Steve King's Virginia Midland, he says, I think we're getting very vulnerable to competition from the family lines and the chassis system type stuff. And I think maybe a merger is in order. And I just blurted out the Appalachian lines. And he says, that's it. And
wow.
Steve King had never been able to come up with a paint scheme, and we were so tired of not being able to paint units for the Virginia Midland. So we said, okay, I'll come up with a standard lettering scheme and a standard paint scheme and all that. All Steve gets to do is choose the 2 colors. and that was Depot olive and yellow, railbox yellow. And that got us off the dime on Steve's paint scheme, finally. And Steve and Alan have been buddies for longer than I've been friends with Alan. They go way back because Steve used to live in Dayton.
So when was the last time you talked to Alan?
Not real long ago, and in fact, we'll probably be talking the next day or two. I was talking to Jerry Albers about how Alan's doing, and apparently he's no longer comfortable speaking in front of audiences. He apparently has some speech issues in front of audiences, but he's working on the idea of creating a video where he can do take 2 and stuff like that. But he's not real comfortable at all doing anything that requires almost live type broadcasting.
Right. But
and we're going to resolve some of that in the next day or two.
Oh, that'd be something, eh? If you guys could figure out a way for him to do some sort of a video thing or something.
Yeah, that wasn't my idea. I had nothing to do with that. It was Jerry just clued me in about that.
Yeah, but still, it's a good idea. Whether it's yours or not, it's still a great idea. I mean, I understand if it's not my idea, then everybody might question it. But earlier on, you were saying something about Lionel, and I was thinking, I can't remember, but it was something really funny too. This is Dave. What do you think about this so far?
I'm having a ball.
I know, but
this is like going to I don't know, like a celebration week at your favorite ballpark. I mean, I'm hearing stories about the people that I've looked up to since I first started to read Model Railroader and Rare Model Craftsman in the early '80s, and Allen McClelland's Virginia and Ohio. Tony and I have talked about this, like that in the Allegheny Midland. In the early '80s, mid '80s, when those were in Model Railroad and Rare Model Craftsman, those were the layouts I was most excited to see because they were the ones modeling, hood units and, pushing sort of a modern approach to railroad operations, which as a kid in a non-train family, my grandfather loved trains, but he had passed away fairly early and he had Alzheimer's towards the end, so I never knew him as well as I'd like to have known him. He was the one from up around Syracuse. The Abel side was from here in Chester, New Jersey, and no intrinsic love for railroading here in New Jersey. So I kind of grew up not knowing that all these great model railroads were people I could write to or talk to, and I'm still amazed at how much great model railroading there is an hour from where I grew up or less, and I had no idea, no clue when I was a kid, but. To read, to Allen McClelland, there's still pictures that I see periodically in calendars, or they show up occasionally in Model Railroader. Rare Model Craftsman is one of the in the trackside photos, or the photos of different people's layouts. Where Allen would have dusted in a fog machine, and there's a red, a red like signal, and a pair of V&O diesels coming by it in the morning fog. And as a kid, I mean, Tony, it blew my mind. I was like, that is what I want to be around. That is unbelievable. How is that even a model railroad? And then the Allegheny Midland. I mean, the way that you were able to graph in, you had your brightly colored hood units, and they were down in these hollers, and you did such a beautiful job with the different codes of rail. The track work flowed, but you had ballast that looked like actual ballast, not model railroady ballast, but actual cinders and filth and dirt and grit. And as a kid that didn't have any context of model railroading besides my own passion, a lot like your story when you were young. And it's interesting, we never talked about that, but same sort of startup where you had the bug and your dad didn't. And my dad knew of railroads, but he didn't have the bug either. But your Allegheny Midland did the same thing for me. As I was a wide-eyed kid in Long Valley, New Jersey, all through the '80s because of these two layouts. And then we started to see the pool power, where you would pull some of Allen's power in your pictures. And likewise, he would have some Allegheny Midland stuff on his railroad. And I just thought this was the cat's meow. I was just thrilled. I mean, it was like Christmas Day. I was talking with Otto Von Track about this. It's Christmas Day was when these magazines would show up in the mailbox, in Parker Road and Long Valley. And I got to see what you guys were doing. And it moved me. And it took me someplace. It gave me a vision for what I wanted to do with this hobby someday when I was able to do it. And so I don't know, I'm eternally grateful for that. It's a rare opportunity to be able to talk in real time about these things. And but the Allegheny Midland, it opened my eyes to what you could do with model railroading, and likewise the Virginia and Ohio. Right, same story.
So did the Allegheny or the Virginia and Ohio was a huge influence on the Allegheny Midland? Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. It was a you can't lose kind of thing, because when I went out to Allen's and I asked him about how he handled turnouts, and he said, well, just this, and I was, well, that's easy. That was about the only technical thing that looked hard. And it turns out it wasn't hard at all. But it was very much that same way with a nickel plate with Bill Darnaby. Once you saw what the Maumee route had done, well, that worked. all I got to do is not screw it up. Well, it was the same way with the V&O, that as long as you didn't screw it up, it looked like you were pretty well guaranteed. The one thing the Allegheny Midland did that was pioneering, I guess, was that it relied totally on muzzle loading or stub-ended staging yards. To the best of my knowledge, nobody had relied 100% on those at that time, where you just absolutely had to assume that you could preload enough trains ahead of time to cover an op session. And at that time, we ran a 24-hour day at 6 to 1. So you had to have enough trains ready to go in staging, or be able to build them in the 2 yards or up on the branch to cover everything you needed to do that day. And it worked.
All right, so, I got a question for you. This is partly blowing my own horn. This is a question I'd really like you to think about, because Dave, I've told you this story before, I think. I built a house specifically. I built the basement specifically so it would house a model railroad. Put steel beam in there and everything, and told those who needed to know that, oh yeah, well, it'll give us more structural stability with a steel beam. Blah blah blah. I can remember sitting in my workshop trying to decide on what color my paint scheme should be, and I literally can remember sitting there in this incredible, now it sounds incredibly presumptuous or egotistical or whatever, but I can remember sitting there going, okay, well, it can't be blue and white because that's a Virginia and Ohio, and it can't be red and yellow because that's the Allegheny Midland, and if I ever get on the cover of Model Railroader, I don't want it to clash with those ones. And so I'm telling you that story because I actually had that moment where I kind of went, I plan on being in Model Railroader, which was incredibly presumptuous and ethical at the time. But do you remember the time? Because you're right, the muzzle loading or stub-ended staging was something pretty revolutionary that you came up with. Do you remember the moment, the time, the week where you kind of went, I'm going to do this, and this is, I know you wouldn't have said to yourself, this is different, but it's something that you wanted to do to suit your needs. Do you remember that thought process at all?
Well, yeah. I mean, it just seemed like a return loop was impractical. I couldn't figure out a way to incorporate it into either end of the railroad. And the nickel plate's the same way. I mean, there's no way to put a return loop at the end of the railroad to get stuff back. It was just purely an engineering consideration. I didn't see an option, and I don't know how people do that.
But you had to realize at that time you were stepping away from the norm, because the norm at that time was, a return loop staging, and you have decided, okay, I'm going a different route, and as you're building this layout. Am I making sense, Dave?
I think you are. I mean, it's and this is still a debate that goes on and on and on. And a lot of Tony's, the stuff that he puts together for Model Railroad Planning every year, which is still one of my favorite publications year over year.
Okay, now you're just sucking up.
No, it's true. It's because it pushes the envelope of what's.
Don't lose my question though, because my point is, he came up with something that really, that's how I did my staging. That's how most people do their staging now, is the stub-ended staging. And I mean, he had to step out of the main flow of traffic and go, well, I'm doing it this way.
Well, it without a doubt. And I think one of the things that comes to mind is Harold's layout. Harold Worthwine up here in New Jersey with his Erie. And I think that was later than the Allegheny Midland, or was that around the same time, Tony?
No, it was later, because I had it almost built, and he came down and I showed him how to lay turnouts.
Okay. And Harold Worthwine, he had a big stub end staging layout as well. So it was an idea that was developing, and I think that without a doubt, the Allegheny Midland, again for me, and the Virginia and Ohio were the two that really started to push the envelope of having that off stage area where, there's a back, just like a play. Like you go see a play, And there's a bunch of stuff that happens, quote unquote, backstage. And the Brits have it with their fiddle staging yards, and we've done it with some stub end. On the Onondaga cutoff, we do it with a double end staging yard. But the idea remains that there's a bunch of back scene things that happen to prepare for the railroad to have actors that run over it. People running these trains. So yeah, I never got to see the Allegheny Midland. That's something I wish I had been able to see, but I've thoroughly enjoyed the times that I've been up on the nickel plate, and I've learned a lot from just absorbing the energy of those operating sessions. It's a time machine. It's an absolute time machine.
All right, Tony, let me ask you this question. This is strictly for my own personal satisfaction. Do you get a sense, or do you look back now at those times in the late 60s and the 70s when you discovered Allen McClelland and you guys made the V&O story? Do you look back now as, to me, in my mind, I see Allen McClelland as, there have been people through the years, Al Kalmbach, who started Model Railroader, and there's been people through the years, but it seems to me like Allen McClelland was like one of the guys. Like if he was one of the 2 or 3 guys in the hobby that kind of made, boom, we're going in this direction. Like, does that make sense?
Yes, and I totally agree. I think it was a matter of timing for one thing. If he'd have come along 10 years earlier, he could not have done what he did. The fact that GE Aztrack occurred when he needed it. Bill Darnaby is another example of that occurring at the right time. He said he designed the railroad under the assumption that a control system would make it feasible to do what he knew it needed to do, and DCC came along in the nick of time. He was lucky. Allen was lucky, but luck is sometimes where preparedness runs into opportunity, and so I think, for my money, McClellan is probably the most influential modeler in terms of putting the whole package together that we've ever had. The John Allen fans are going to throw stones at me, but John Allen was a friend, so I'm not knocking John. John Allen did probably more with what he had at the time than anybody else did, and he was not just a scenery guy, because he used Baker couplers, which nobody'd use unless they really needed to operate. So he was an operator, as Andy Sprandio has often said. And what John accomplished with what he had back in those days, which was the 50s and into the 60s, was remarkable. But he was just behind the power curve that Allen was able to take advantage of. Now, if John had been 10 years later and had advantage of the command control systems and stuff, then the G&D, Gory Undefeated, would have been different. It just would have been, because the technology would have been available to him. But Allen was there at the right time, and he was the one person who said plastic F units and strings of hopper cars, look-alike hopper cars and all that. Lichen, later covered with ground foam. I think we can put this all together in an attractive package and make some very realistic Appalachian modeling come to pass. And he grasped staging, even though he didn't fully grasp it. He had a handle on it. He got all the pieces together in one place. And he's the first one that I'm aware of that did all those things. So I put him at the top of the heap. I can't think of anybody that did a better job of putting all the pieces together that today we consider to be just the way to go.
He strikes me as a visionary. It wasn't a visionary for weathering or scenery or operations per se. He saw the whole package, I think, and that's something you pointed it out in your most recent trains of thought.
Yep.
And in reflecting on that over the last couple of weeks, looking forward to tonight, that it's funny. That's a salient piece, and it directly ties in, I think, to some of the most powerful parts of the hobby today, is that there's an opportunity now so much groundwork has been done with command control, sound, smoke, lighting. We talked about animation earlier. That's another whole thing with some of the ambient sounds. I heard that for the first time on your layout, Tony, and I've added some here on the OC. But like you were talking about with the windmills and some of the European initiatives where they've had other animation cars driving on roads and airplanes taking off and what have you. But Allen tied all of these different ends together and created an operating experience. So you could railroad. You went to his house. Again, I've never been there. I wish I had. But you went and you railroaded. And railroading takes a group of people. There's no railroad that runs with one person anywhere. And it takes camaraderie. It takes some back and forth. It takes some paperwork. And I think that Allen, with all the different things that he pushed, the stub end staging and the plain Jane paint schemes and the atmospheric conditions on the layout and the walk around controls, these are all things that push towards the prototype. And modern operations owes a great deal of gratitude to Allen and frankly to you and the whole hobby press that embraced it and pushed it forward so that the rest of us could read about it. So it's amazing. It's amazing.
I got Tony, take a rest here. I got something to say too. Dave, you're going to love this. I got two things. I got to tell my Allen McClelland story, even though I've told it before many times. But I'm going to tell it first, and I'll say my other thing. So, in 1992, the NMRA National Convention is in Columbus, Ohio. And by then, I had made a connection with Allen, and we had at least gotten to a point where I could call him up and talk to him. So I decided, without any help from anybody else, that because the NMRA National Convention was in Columbus, Ohio, and Allen's layout was on one of the layout tours, I decided that I would call Allen and volunteer to help operate his railroad during the layout tours. So I call him up, and Allen, of course, being the gentleman that he was very gracious and explained to me that he had all the operators he needed, and thanks very much for my offer, but he didn't need me to come by. So I thought about that for a few days and realized that he probably hadn't understood what I said. So I called him back, and I said, the layout tour is coming to your house. You're going to need operators. I'm available. There's nothing I'd like better than to come by and help. Once again, Allen McClellan explained to me, he says, that's very gracious. I understand you're Canadian, and this is the way, perhaps you don't understand, but he says, I have all the operators I need, and thanks very much. To which I blurted out something to the effect of, well, I'll bring coffee and donuts. Like, I'll bring as many donuts and coffee and snacks for all the people that come by on the bus. And there's silence at the other end of the phone. And finally he says, well, if you're going to bring donuts, I guess. He says, I don't have anything for you to do, but if you're that desperate to come by and you're going to bring donuts, okay, come on by. So and it was a fair drive from Columbus to Dayton. So I get up and, do my hair and make sure I'm wearing a clean shirt. And I hustle over there and I buy a bunch of donuts and I show up at the door. And I'm the first one to arrive, obviously, much early, very much earlier than I needed to be. And he greets me at the door and he says, it's good that you're here. One of my operators isn't going to be able to make it, so I'm going to need you to help run the layout during the layout tour. And he he takes me downstairs, gives me a throttle, shows me how to operate the railroad, pulls a train out of the yard, with 5 cars on it, and he says, I got some more stuff I got to do upstairs and get prepared. So he says, you run this train around the layout. And he disappears. And there I am, standing in the middle of the Virginia and Ohio by myself.
Awesome.
Operating a train for like 20 to 30 minutes by myself. And I'm like, this can't possibly be happening.
You see, like, this is what I'm talking about. Like, what a great hobby.
Yeah.
But that's Lionel. You are a persistent guy. That is one thing that's become very clear as you and I have talked now in the last year or year and a half or whatever it's been. And what a great story. That's fantastic.
That's my favorite story that I actually submitted that. And it was when they did an update on Allen's newest version of the VNO. I forget what year that was. That was like 15 years ago or somewhere anyways. And they did a big spread and they put that, I wrote that story up and they put that in along with the rest of the story. And I was like, it's the favorite thing that I ever wrote that's in Model Railroader. That's my favorite thing walking away is telling that story. However, the other thing I wanted to say, Dave, is do you realize that it was like, okay, we all agree that Allen McClelland was instrumental in making the hobby what it was today. But do you realize, Dave, that it was kind of like a Superman, Marvel Comics kind of thing where these two bolts of lightning met? Like if great Allen McClelland was here, but then this other bolt of lightning came in and called Tony Custer, and together these guys created what the hobby is today. I mean, Allen McClelland certainly was who he was, but without the mixture of Tony Custer, I don't think we'd be even having this conversation.
Well, again, I totally agree with you because, Tony took Allen's railroad and recognized it immediately for what it was. We heard this earlier today. And then it became something you'd see in the magazines. So instead of Allen doing his own thing and having a wonderful time of it, the creativity, the passion, but also that vision of having these different aspects to create a stage for your railroad staging, to have the walk around, to get the engineering experience of running a train and you walk around with a throttle, the plain Jane paint scheme, the plausibility of the whole thing. Plausibility is something that's been in Tony's column for decades at this point. And it's something I keep in mind with all my modeling because railroading is not exceptional. That's, in fact, you don't want to be on the unusual occurrence report on the morning call at NJ Transit. Every time you're on the UOR, the unusual occurrence report, it means you dropped the ball or somebody from your team dropped the ball, and then you get to explain what happened. So the plain Jane days, that means you win, that you're way out ahead of the curve if you can keep it on the plain Jane. Allen nailed it, but Tony brought it to the world. And of course, it manifested itself and it's gone on and on and on. But there is absolutely zero question that when Jack or Rich Wisniewski or myself, when we're doing Onondaga cutoff operation preparation, when we're looking at vision, my own vision for the OC, and this is something Tony helped me develop when I was able to write an article for him for Model Railroad Planning a couple of years ago. You need to tell the story of the railroad. Every picture needs to tell a story. And we need to understand where it came from, but why it is what it is to you. And I had to really think about that because I never really put that together in a linear fashion, which is sort of funny because engineers like myself tend to think pretty linearly. But Tony really, really pushed me to take that to the next level. And there's just no question. That confluence of the Virginian and Ohio, but then Tony's creativity and editorial prowess, and then the combination of those two railroads in the magazines in the 80s, there's a whole generation of model railroaders, myself included, that atmosphere of railroading is why we do operations. It's why operations is exciting. So without a doubt, I mean, it's, in hindsight, it might seem, oh, well, of course, it's just Tony and Allen, two of the best names or best known names in the whole hobby. But boy, what a confluence of energy. It really is spectacular.
Yeah.
And it's a hoot.
If they'd been in the WWF as a tag team wrestling partnership, nobody would have been able to beat them.
I'm going to guess that's the first time that Tony Custer's ever been asked to compare himself to the WWF. Just a guess.
Right. and are either of you surprised?
No, not one bit. Not one bit. And it's true because that back and forth, it's fantastic. And listen to Tony's stories about, Jim Boyd, a photographer I've always admired from the railfan standpoint, because I love watching trains too. So it's neat. It's neat. It's a pleasure to be here and talk to you both about this stuff. It really is.
So I'm going to finish up with two things, Tony. Number one, we've only really basically made it to the end of the mid to late 70s. So would you be willing to come back on and continue this saga?
Oh, I'd love to.
All right. So after the show, we'll make arrangements for when we're going to continue this, because I know I'm having more fun than I could. This makes me feel like the podcast is worthwhile, because I know there's people out there that are going, I didn't know that. So my second point is, it's a question. Now that we're talking about the Allen McClellan years, and, in the next podcast, we'll move on to other things, because you've done at least one or two other things in the hobby. But when you look back, as Dave and I have just said, about what an impact Allen McClellan and you two guys had together, because Allen McClellan wouldn't have ended up as Allen McClellan without Tony, and I'm not sure Tony would have ended up as Tony without Allen. Do you look back at any point over the years and kind of look back at that time and go, holy smokes?
Well, the mid-'70s, when the V&O story came out, were the golden years. The best way I can explain that is that Bill Schomburg, Jim Boyd, and I took a tour of New England to see some outstanding model railroads, and there's even more outstanding model railroads up there today. But the tour ended going in the stairs of a basement, and we walked into the basement, and it's this dark, dingy place with checkerboard tile on the floor, this big octopus of a furnace with ductwork all over the place, a sink, no sign of a model railroad. And I looked down at the far end of the basement, and there's a walled-off room, and the door's open, and you can see there's a model railroad in this, small room, and trains are going by. So I walked down to the end of the basement and bellied up to this model railroad, and this guy's sitting on his throne in the middle of the room, and the trains are going around him as they typically did on model railroads back in the dark ages, and in racetrack fashion. And he looks me right in the eye and he says, "You're wondering what you're doing here, aren't you?" Oh my God, And I started to mutter something about, well, I learned something from every model railroad I visited. And before I could even get that platitude out like that, he said, "Let me tell you something." He says, "Tomorrow morning, this entire basement's being cleared out. This room, this railroad, that big octopus of a furnace, the sinks, everything comes out of this room. It's being stripped to the bare walls. And then a new model railroad around the walls with a central peninsula is being built. And the reason it's being built like that is the Virginia and Ohio story on railroad model Craftsman." He said, "I thought you'd like to know, and I hope you'll pass this on to Allen McClellan, what an influence that series of articles had." And I'd have to say that was one of the highlights of my life.
Wow.
So that was the golden years.
Awesome.
One of the highlights of his life, Dave.
Awesome. Yeah. Awesome. What a goofy idea this podcast was. What a great thing this has been, eh? I mean, hey, amen. Look,
unbelievable.
The long form. I keep telling the long form interview. And Tony, this is something, my dad, I told him the first time I was interviewed with Lionel, one of the things that entertained me about the AML, the whole A Modeler's Life idea, is that it's almost all long form interviews like this. And I remember my dad would sit at the kitchen table in my house in Long Valley, New Jersey, growing up in 1982 or 83. And he would listen to AM radio. We had one of those little under the cabinet radios that would hang up there. And he'd sit in the dark with his hands on his forehead, with his hand on his forehead, with his fingers on each side of his head, eyes shut, elbow on the table. It was dark, and the only light was the blue from the radio. And he would sit. I used to walk in as a little kid and see him sitting there listening to either Princeton basketball in the wintertime. His brother had gone to Princeton for a couple of years, and my grandmother was a huge Princeton basketball fan. Or he would listen to talk radio and listen to, one of the announcers in the early 80s on CBS or NBC, and they would interview the president or they'd interview the senator or and again, he would sit and he would listen. And I remember standing there as a little child and watching this and just being fascinated that my dad could listen to these long discussions on, and sure enough, the AML is these long discussions. And I love the stories that come out on this stuff. This is the stuff that I would love to talk to you about at an operating session, except that we're too busy running a railroad. So it's just great. It's a real pleasure.
Very cool. Very, very cool.
Well, we'll do it again.
Amen. Will. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, because we only got to like the mid to late 70s. And I know for sure, I can't put my finger on it, but I'm almost positive, and Dave, you can back me up on this. But I think Tony's written, there's a column or something that he's written. I don't know. It's somewhere. We'll find it. Between now and then, we'll do some research and find out more about it.
He's written a couple things. Yeah. Okay. It's thanks to him that I got into writing for the Model Railroad Press at all. So I'm grateful.
You wrote a book?
I wrote a book.
Holy mackerel.
Yeah. At Tony's not just suggestion, but then I tried to pass it off to other people that are signal experts in the hobby. And Tony had a come to Jesus talk with me at an event. We met at a social hour after an event at Ted Pampert's house. And he said, has Comblock reached out to you? We talked about this. And I said, no, I haven't heard from them yet. Like, I think maybe they moved on. And Tony kind of shakes his head and closes his eyes. He says, Dave, I've been doing this a long time. And Tony insisted that I give this a shot because I wanted to write it for Model Railroad Planning. I had so much fun the first time. I learned so much. I wanted to stick with what I knew, and that was not acceptable to Tony. So we went forward, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me as far as writing goes. So I'm, again, very grateful and very much appreciate the guidance and the vision for hopefully what I can continue to contribute in the future. A lot of opportunity.
So this is being released this will be broadcast in the fall of 2021, just a couple of months from when we're doing it. We like to stay ahead here a little bit at the old AML. So where can people purchase your book, Dave?
The book Signals and Interlockings for Your Model Railroad. It's actually called A Guide to Signals and Interlockings for Your Model Railroad. It's available from Comblock, from the publisher directly. It'll also be on Amazon. Or your local hobby shop, and we're big supporters of the local hobby shop. So, of course, that's the best place, I think, to pick one up. But the next edition will have been in print by then. It should be out around the countryside with a couple different typos fixed and some minor things that we found after the first printing. But it's, again, I hope that it provides some illumination into the layers of signaling and how modelers can approach signaling for the railroads. And in that idea of animation we talked about earlier tonight, signals are one of the primary animated things next to the railroad that are railroad related. And there's a lot of opportunity for us all to include that stuff. So
you say this.
Take a look.
You said the second edition? What's that? Did the first one sell out already?
The first one sold out.
Holy mackerel. Yes.
So Tony's vision was correct. And then you, of course, were the first one to say, this is going to be the best-selling book. And this is a great idea. And I was like, it's signaling. It's a niche. It's a niche of a niche. Well, both of you guys were right, and I'm learning to listen a little bit better. That's how life goes sometimes.
All right. So we're going to do this again, Tony. This is very cool. I very, very much appreciate you taking the time out to do this. But I think you're going to find a lot of people are going to be very, very interested in hearing all these cool stories from the one and only Tony Custer, who needs no introduction, by the way, Dave.
That's true.
So the first thing we have to do, Dave, is we have to do the email address. And I was wondering if you'd like to take a crack at that. It's pretty complicated.
It is pretty complicated. But it's important to remember that it's a modlerslife@gmail.com. And that's Modler's Life with one L. Like Abelese, not two L's like nickel plate.
Oh, nice one. Ooh, very well done.
Nickel plate. You got to love the nickel plate.
Yeah, exactly.
It's an awesome railroad.
I get what you're doing there. There's an L in nickel and an L in plate, so two L's like nickel plate.
Yeah, it just came to me.
Wow, you are the. Have you ever, Tony? Have you ever met? I know that Dave is a man of not many words, but seriously, Tony, the first time you met Dave, were you thinking this to yourself? What the hell?
No, he's from Jersey.
That's honest. I love it. I mean, I was starstruck. The first time I met Tony, do you remember when Rich Taylor brought me and my buddy Mark? We came to your house and you just gave us a layout tour. That was the first time I met you in person, was on the nickel plate. And it was a bit after that. I think I ended up I think I was talking with David Olson and you were short someone. So I got an invite as a guest to come up with David Olson to operate on the nickel plate. But yeah, look, I mean, you get to meet your mentors. I mean, what kind of wonderful world am I in where I get to talk to people I've looked up to and I get people that I've learned from my whole life. And now I get to give them my ideas and they can beat it up, send it back. And guys, where do I sign up? This is great. This is just great.
So when you were telling your Cliff Robinson story there, Tony wanted to talk, but we're not letting him talk anymore. We're doing all the talking, Dave, you and I.
I'm going to stop talking.
Tony, when you were telling your Cliff Robinson story in the next segment, and what you were saying about Cliff like to rent the big suite, in the next segment, we'll find out if you'd ever gotten a ride in a limo, too.
Yeah, I think I remember one.
I love that story.
And then, Dave, will you join us again?
I would be honored. And I'm actually excited, too, to talk about, the transition through the Bell Lab years, because I grew up in Long Valley, which is next to Chester. And Bell Labs, the famous telephone pole farm, was in Chester. And so where Tony was working, and some of Tony's early stories to me about why I needed to stop giving him feedback and just write, and then he would let me know what was good and what wasn't, was based on his experience at Bell Labs. And I think that would be an interesting discussion, at least for me, and hopefully for you too, Lionel. And then of course the model railroad years that followed. It's just a lot of good stuff. It's a pleasure to be here, gentlemen. Thank you.
And we have a website, amodeler'slife.com. If you go to amodeler'slife.com, you'll find out all about the podcast, and we have places there. You can click on the Moderately Agitated Mailboy's face and send us an email, because I'm sure people are going to want to email us about this particular episode. Also, if you go to Midwest Model Railroad, their URL is midwestmodelrr.com. They're in Independence, Missouri, Tony. This is a guy talking about the hobby growing. This is a guy, Stephen Atwell and his dad, Gary. They started 10 years ago in their basement, and they now have a hobby store that's about 12,000 square feet. And it is unbelievably spectacular, successful. It's like shopping in a live Walther's catalog.
It's good to hear good news.
Yeah, but I know you're desperate to have all your AML merchandise, your Modeler's Life merchandise. So if you go to Midwest Model Railroad and go across the navigation bar and click on AML, boom, you are in a wonderland of AML merchandise. You got your T-shirts, your hoodies, your hats, your mugs, whatever you could possibly need. So you want me to put you down for a half a dozen T-shirts? Tony and I have had the best relationship for 35 years. He's like the serious guy, and I'm like this puppy dog that follows along behind him going, can we go over here? Squirrel!
That sounds like me with you guys. It's great.
Yeah.
Just remind me to tell about Lionel's after dinner talk down in Morgantown, West Virginia. I'll save that for the next one.
I will absolutely remind you about that. Yes.
Okay, Tony, at the appropriate moment, you have to say happy rails to you. Now, there's no singing. We don't need you to make it your own personal, give it your own personal flair. We just need you to say with enthusiasm, happy rails to you.
Well, happy rails to you.
But not yet.
Oh. Well, that was a practice run.
Yeah, that was practice, yeah. So,
can I tell you a Jim Boyd story about that?
Absolutely.
Well, Jim Boyd was a big fan of Roy Rogers, and he stopped down at a brand new Roy Rogers down in Paterson, New Jersey. Now, Paterson, New Jersey holds the patent for the New Jersey accent. They say, instead of Newton, they say Newton. They swallow the T and stuff. And when you say Joycey, that's not a New Jersey accent, that's a Brooklyn accent. But at any rate, Jim went into the Roy Rogers and he ordered a sandwich and fries and stuff like that. And the sweet young thing handed him a bag with his lunch in it. And she said the traditional sayonara, which came out, hippie trails. And Jim said, what? And she said, hippie trails. Jim said, hippie trails? She said, yes. He said, don't ever say that again.
I bet you got a million good stories.
Oh, man.
Including a week in a submarine in the North Atlantic that we spent.
Really?
Wow.
Yep.
Wow. All right. So, okay, get ready. Well, Tony, as we close the barn doors on another episode of A Modeler's Life, and the sun slowly sets over the back 40, I guess there's nothing else left to do except for you to say...
Happy trails to you.
No, rails.
Oh, rails. Happy rails to you.
Well, now we got to do it again. See, Dave will tell you that we can't. Yeah, you gotta have the whole thing. It's
all right.
Yeah,
This is exactly what happened to me the first time I tried to do it. I didn't.
It's crucial. The whole show is a complete failure if we don't do it right. Isn't that right, Dave?
That's what I keep being told. Yeah. Yes.
Well,
take two.
Yeah. Well, Tony, it was actually take 3, but who's counting? Well, Tony, because there was that time when you just said it and I didn't say not yet, and that was we're up to 3. We're closing in on a half a dozen. Let's cut that. Let's get to the facts, sir. Okay, that was kind of funny, and I got nothing. It's like I'm playing to an empty room here. Come on, Is this mic on?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Say goodnight, Dave.
Good night, Dave.
Well, Tony, as we close the barn doors on another episode of A Modeler's Life, and the sun slowly sets over the back 40, I guess there's nothing else left to do except for you to say...
Happy rails to you.
While in Busted Knuckle, guests of A Modeler's Life podcast stay at the Casa del Sol Motor Court and Inn, where late-night dancing at the Rumba Room is a magical event to be experienced.
It's another Lincoln Homer.
Awesome.